As you start creating objects, there are some naming conventions that you'll want to follow when defining object properties. Not following these conventions can lead to some sneaky bugs, so I want to spend some time showing you some things that you'll want to avoid, as well as best practices for naming object properties. Okay, so here I have a couple of examples, and let's just walk through each one of these one by one. In the first example, I've got an object called person, and it's got some properties that are used to describe the person. Actually, this person is my dad. So his name's John, he's 55, and he's got 3 children, myself, my twin brother Jared, and my sister Alexis. So anyways, there's 2 things I want to point out here. First, I'm using quotes around the property names. Now, quotes are perfectly valid, but they're not required. However, sometimes when you use quotes around property names, it can mask some potential problems. For example, I'm going to copy this code over to our console, and let's try accessing some of these properties so I can show you what I mean. So we'll copy this and paste it over here. So I've got my person object copied over to the console, and let's give it a go. Remember, we've got 2 different ways to access properties. We can use bracket notation or dot notation, so let's just start with bracket notation first. So let me try person, and let's try to get the name of this person. If we do that, it returns back John. Okay, so that works. That's not a problem. And let's try doing one of the children. So let's do first child, which is me. And awesome, so it returns back James. But now let's try doing it with dot notation. And this is where you're going to see the problem. So if we do dot name, oh, no, that's still okay. But what about first child? Uh-oh, we've got a syntax error. It doesn't seem to like our first child using dot notation. So this is basically the second thing I want to point out. Don't use numbers as the first character in your property names. Technically it works if you're using bracket notation, but it's going to limit you when you're using dot notation, and it's just bad practice in general, so avoid it. And just to show you what I mean by quotes sometimes masking potential problems, if we drop the quotes, which I've done now in this example, and we copy and paste it back over to the console, we're going to get an error back. So yeah, so sometimes quotes can mask potential problems when you're naming object properties. So the moral here is that don't use numbers to start your object property names. And really for this example, for first, second, and third child, to do this right, we should just change this over to being a array that holds the children. Yeah, that's a lot better. All right, so let's move on to this next example. Based on the first example, you might already see where the problems are going to be, but let me go ahead and point them out anyway. So again, we're using quotes for our property names, and it's going to let us get away with some things that normally don't fly. The first is using spaces, and the second is using hyphens. You should definitely avoid doing either of these things for the same reasons as using a number as the first character. Neither of these will work when you use dot notation. So if we copy this over to the JavaScript console and give it a try, we'll see what I mean. So we'll say garage dot fire truck, and uh-oh, yeah, so there's a syntax error here. And then the same thing goes for our hyphen. If we say race dash car, again, another syntax error. Now the reason I've got this as a different example is because both of these properties are examples of multi-word property names. If you want to use multi-word properties, instead of using a space or a hyphen, the preferred method is using camel casing. Now camel casing is pretty simple. You just remove the spaces between multiple words, so we'll do that here, or in this case a hyphen, and then you want to uppercase first letter in the rest of the words throughout the property name. So to recap, property names can be any combination of upper and lowercase letters as well as numbers, just as long as numbers aren't the beginning of your property name. Like you can put a number anywhere in here and that's going to be fine, just not at the beginning. Also, using camel casing for multi-word properties is going to be better than using spaces or hyphens. Again, you can use spaces or hyphens when you're using quotes around your property names, but then it's going to break on you when you try to use dot notation to access those properties. So rather than doing that, just avoid that completely and use camel casing. That's going to be your best bet. Finally, one other thing worth mentioning is that all of these rules also apply to just normal variable names. So if your variable name is good, then it is probably also good for a property name.